Hey, everybody. So I've tried recording this before, and I had my hard drive crash and lost everything, including the video. So we're recording it again. This is chapter 5 for human biology, and we're going to go over the cardiovascular system. We'll also talk about the lymphatic system. The purpose of the lymphatic system is to return fluid to the cardiovascular system. Whenever your heart's pumping, blood's going out through the vessels, gets to the capillaries. The formed elements, I'm talking about the cells and cell fragments, big proteins like albumins, they stay in the capillary, but fluid goes out. I'm talking about the plasma contents. They go out, and that's how you deliver oxygen, how you deliver nutrients to cells, how you pick up waste. You bring that back in from the cells, from the tissue, the fluid around the cells. We call that interstitial fluid. You bring that fluid that came out of the cardiovascular system back into the cardiovascular system, comes back at the end of the capillary into the venules and can be carried away. But you never take back in as much as you put out. So that means you should be filling up, puffing up, puffing up, puffing up, puffing up lots of fluid. And that can actually happen. It's called edema. But we have a whole system, the lymphatic system, that is to drain that excess fluid. So the idea is cardiovascular system puts fluid out into the interstitial. Then we bring that fluid back, but not all of it. It's okay though, because the lymphatic system will collect that extra fluid, and you will travel through the lymphatic system, and at two spots in the body, you'll put it back in the circulatory system. So anyway, that's a high level overview. Let's hurry on. The cardiovascular system, we got the heart, we got the blood vessels. The heart, obviously made out of cardiac muscle. It's the pump. It generates the pressure to move things around. The blood is carrying oxygen, carrying nutrients to the cells that need it, to the tissues, to the whole body. And as I said, what happens is there's fluid around those cells that we call interstitial fluid, around the tissue cells. And that interstitial fluid, we have blood plasma go into it, deliver things, pick up waste, come back. It's draining that interstitial fluid. As soon as it crosses the wall into the capillary, we go back to calling it plasma. Anyway, and you never take back everything that you push out. Cardiovascular system doesn't pull it all back, so we have the lymphatic to drain. All right, so homeostasis. The cardiovascular system is what hooks the digestive system to everything else, carrying nutrients from digestive to everything else. It's what hooks the respiratory system to everything else. It carries oxygen and carbon dioxide throughout the body. All right. And you can see their urinary system. It's what carries stuff off to be filtered in the kidneys to get rid of waste. Let's move on. So the cardiovascular system functions, we just went over that a little bit. It transports oxygen and carbon dioxide, oxygen from the lungs, carbon dioxide to the lungs. Waste products, hormones, nutrients. I hadn't mentioned hormones yet, but yeah. The cells in the immune system are transported to help the body from infection. What we're saying there is that we carry lots of white blood cells around, so they can find and attack things that need getting rid of. But it's worth pointing out the lymphatic system is full of lymphocytes. It has its own set of white blood cells too. Anyway, the the blood, we're trying to keep the pH at a certain level. That level, by the way, is 7.35 to 7.45. Most people say 7.4, but in reality, you can vary a little low, a little high. You'll be solid if you're in that range. If you go below 7.35, we would say you're in acidosis. Your blood is more acidic than it should be. And that's still true, even though people are going to say, but 7.35 is above 7, so it's really basic. It's not acidic. That's all true. But you're closer to being acid than you should be. So we would call that acidosis. Anyway, so the lymphatic system, you've already heard this, assists the cardiovascular by collecting excess interstitial fluid and returning it back to the blood. While it's in the lymphatic vessels, we call it lymph. You've all seen this. If you ever gotten a blister and it breaks open, you have that clear fluid. That's what we're talking about. That's lymph. That's the lymph. All right, moving on. So here's a check your progress. I'm going to pause and let you see if you can answer these. If you can't, rewind the video, watch it again, and we'll continue in just a bit. Okay. So we're talking about types of blood vessels, and I want you to know that arteries always carry blood away. Arteries carry blood away from the heart, and vessels bring the veins bring blood very close to the heart, bring it to the heart, basically. So, A for arteries away, V for veins, very close, but actually bring it to the heart. In between those, you're going to have little arteries we call arterioles, little veins we call venules. And so it's artery, arterial, capillary, venule, vein. Anyway, and it says structure and function of the three. I'm thinking of maybe they're going to tell you about the three types of capillaries, which would be continuous, sinusoidal, and fenestrated, but we'll see. Anyway, we're going to talk about how you can dilate or contract the wall of a blood vessel to control how much blood gets through it. All right, so yeah, they're going with arteries, veins, capillaries. They would consider an arteriole a little artery and a venule a little vein. That's fine. So know that if you're moving from the heart to the tissue, you would go through arteries, arterioles, capillaries. That's at the tissue. Then as you're collecting the blood to return collecting the fluid to return to the blood, return to the circulatory system, return to the heart, you're going to go from capillary to venule to vein. Anyway, so arteries carry blood away. You've got that. The wall has three layers. The endothelium is the inner layer. That's easy because the word endo means inside. So it's inner, it's thin. What they're not saying there is if it's not damaged, if it's not covered with plaque and nastiness, it's super smooth, super slippery. So blood cells, they can go sliding right by. If they touch the wall, it doesn't matter. The middle layer, most people would call a myothelium. Myo for muscle. This is smooth muscle. You can't control it. You can't say, oh, I will vasodilate, or oh, I will vasoconstrict. It's not under your conscious control, like finger, oh, I will bend, or oh, I won't. But it's super important because you have to have control over where the blood goes. We don't even have enough blood in the body to vasodilate all the blood vessels. Our circulatory system can hold more blood than is normally in the body. So you've even heard of what happens whenever we accidentally vasodilate everything. We call that anaphylactic shock, and obviously the blood pressure drops as everything opens up wide. Anyway, So elastic arteries, I guess we're not talking about that either. But there are smooth in these in the wall, the myothelium, in that layer, you have muscle fibers and elastic fibers. Elastic fibers are made out of the protein elastin, super stretchy, you probably guessed from the name. And so you have two different types of blood vessels. Two different types of arteries. You have elastic arteries and conducting arteries. Elastic arteries are ones that, as part of their job, they stretch with every beat of the heart and then return to normal. What this does is help smooth out the spikes in pressure that would be caused by a heartbeat. And the aorta is the big example of that, the huge example. But all the larger vessels closer to the heart, they're probably have a higher amount of elastic fibers in it than the arteries that are much further away. Anyway, and the outer layer, connective tissue, it's tough, it's protective. All right, so here we've got our endometrium, myometrium, and what they're calling the outer connective tissue layer. But if you look at this, look at the difference in the artery and the vein. The artery is huge, thick wall, lots of muscle, lots of vasodilation, vasoconstriction possibilities. The vein has a lot bigger lumen, a lot bigger hole in the middle, but the wall's kind of thin and flabby. You see that? See that? Okay. Um, I should probably move this. I just noticed that where I stuck it is very in the way and distracting. Sorry, guys. All right. So understand that arteries tend to have higher pressure than veins. There are a couple ways to look at this. One is, hey, they're closer to the heart. So of course they're higher pressure. Another one would be, well, look, they've got a smaller loop and a smaller hole. Of course they're at higher pressure. If you take the same blood and you put it in an expanded area, less pressure. But another way to think about it is, well, of course the vein has a thinner wall. It's at lower pressure. And of course the artery has a thicker wall. It has to deal with that pressure. Anyway, so arterioles are little arteries. We've talked about that before. The middle layer is mostly smooth muscle. That means we don't have all of that elastic fiber stuff going on. It can do vasoconstriction or vasodilation. All right. If it vasoconstricts, you make the whole tube narrower, and that will raise the blood pressure and lower the amount of blood going through. When you vasodilate, you get bigger, lower the pressure, more blood. All right. Capillaries are, sorry about that. Capillaries are gas exchange areas. They're super thin. Basically, they have nothing but that inner layer. They have that endothelium and nothing else. Why? Well, because if you have a super, super thin wall, it's easy to exchange gases across it. It's easy to exchange fluids across it. Now, there actually are three kinds of capillaries. There are what we call continuous ones, which are like you'd expect, a tube. And there are ones that we call fenestrated. The German word der Fenster means the window. These are ones that have little holes in them, like a sieve or a colander, super good at passing things through. And then your ones that we call sinusoidal capillaries. Their wall is not complete. They've got gaps where the cells don't come together really well. Anyway, before each capillary bed, the capillary bed is just a collection of capillaries. So say my arm's the arterial, we go into a whole bunch of capillaries when we have all my fingers. Then that would be a capillary bed. Then when they collect, we have a venule going on the other way. But right here, before the capillary bed, where my watch is, we would pretend my watch is the precapillary sphincter. So arterial coming in, and then you have a band of muscle. Sphincter is like, yes, no. What we're talking about is, remember, we made this big deal about how we could do vasodilation, vasoconstriction. You can't do that in a capillary because it doesn't have a muscle layer. So instead, we put this sphincter upstream, and it can constrict to cut off the blood flow through all of those capillaries, or dilate to let blood flow through all those capillaries. All right. And if we close the sphincter, the blood is going to go through the shunt instead, the arteriovenous shunt. So here's a pretty picture. We got blood going from an arterial to a venule. If it takes the straight shot, that's the shunt. That's what it does if all these sphincters are shut. But if these sphincters are open, then the blood will go meandering through the tissues, through the capillary bed, and there'll be lots of gas exchange and nutrient exchange and all that. All right, moving on. So just like we had little arteries we call arterioles, we have little veins we call venules. They receive the capillary blood. They carry that blood to the heart. Remember, arteries away, veins very close. You're taking them to the heart. That's pretty close. It's right there. Anyway, it says they have the same 3 layers as arteries, but less smooth muscle in the middle. You've already seen that. Here's an artery with a nice thick wall, big myometrium, big muscle layer. Here's a vein with thin, flabby wall. Very little muscle. All right, moving on. And they have valves, one-way valves. This is super important. And everything that you're hearing me say here about veins will be true like 10 times more when we do arteries. So here's the deal. Say you have a vein, and it's a vein like the saphenous vein in the leg. It's carrying blood up. It's carrying blood against gravity. So every time the heart beats and there's pressure, it goes up. When the heart relaxes, there's no pressure and it wants to come back down. Gravity wants to pull that blood down. Well, we don't want to do that. We want to keep sending blood around through the body. How do you make sure blood can go up but not down? My arms are little flaps of my hands here, little flaps of endothelium. And a couple of flaps form a valve. So what happens is when the pressure builds from a heartbeat, then you want to send fluid up. And these 2 little endothelial flaps fold to the side, and the blood goes up. But then when the heart relaxes and the blood tries to come down, what it actually does is pull the flaps away from the wall. They touch each other, and the blood is collected. It's caught up here. It can't go back down. So every time you have a heartbeat, I guess the sound effects are not relevant, but my idea is pressure, you pass fluid. No pressure, you stop it from going back. Pressure, you stop the fluid. No pressure, you stop it from going back. Okay, straightforward enough. We'll probably talk about the ways that outside muscles can squeeze those veins to make them to make the pressure go. If we don't, you're going to hear it when we get to the lymphatic system. So I might as well do it now. Each muscle, when you contract it, that muscle is going to get shorter and thicker, shorter and thicker. All right. So say you have a vein right here going vertically, and it's between 2 muscles. And when you use those muscles, they get shorter and thicker. Sorry, I should say shorter and thicker. As they get thicker, they push on that vein. So they generate pressure, and it's easy to understand what's happening. If you've ever seen one of those long, thin balloons that people make balloons out of, and you squeeze it in the middle, the air goes to the two sides. Well, now let's put the balloon vertically. And you squeeze it in the middle, and the air goes up and down. Well, if muscles get thicker, they push that vein in the middle, and blood wants to go up and down. Problem is it can't go down, so it only goes up. It can't go down because we have the one-way valves. All right. So the walls of veins are thinner than arteries. We already talked about that. 70% of your blood is in the venous system. And if we are bleeding out, the nervous system is going to try to get them to constrict, vasoconstrict, to reduce the drop in pressure. So it's like you're bleeding out, your blood pressure is dropping. Oh no, the brain needs oxygen. We got to have blood no matter what. So we get smaller to raise the amount of pressure, so we're still sending blood to the brain. All right, it's a check your progress. I'm going to be quiet for a little bit. You see if you can answer all of these. If not, pause the video or roll the video back, watch this section again, and then we'll continue. Okay, let's move on. So the heart is a double pump. What they mean is we got the atria at the top and then the ventricle, the atria and then the ventricle, the atria and the ventricle. And then describe the flow of blood through the human heart. Super important, got to know it. The easiest method, in my opinion, is to learn the Happy Days Pump Your Blood song. And the first verse of that tells you how blood goes through the heart. I know I can't sing, but I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway, so I'm sorry. The right atria is where the process begins, where the CO2 blood enters the heart through the tricuspid valve to the right ventricle, the pulmonary arteries and lungs. It should have said pulmonary semilunar valve, pulmonary trunk, pulmonary arteries and lungs. Anyway, once inside the lungs, it dumps the carbon dioxide and picks up its oxygen supply. Then it's back to the heart through the pulmonary veins, through the atria and left ventricle. And right there, it left out the bicuspid. It should have said atria, bicuspid, and ventricle. Anyway, and then we'll talk about the SA node, the AV node, and the super scary vagus nerve. Okay, not always super scary, but all right. So the heart's between your lungs. It has a tip that we call an apex that's over to the side. This is my left side over here. So the apex is pointed down there. It's about the size of your fist. It's mostly made out of myocardium. Basically, we got the same 3 layers that we had in an artery, but we got a thick muscle layer. And I'll tell you right now, that's kind of true. In reality, what you have is a thick muscle layer, and it's thickest where you need to push the most blood. You need to generate the most blood pressure. So think of atria and ventricle. If the blood is collecting in the atria and you're going to move it to the ventricle, you're only moving that blood like from here to there, right? You're going from the atria to the ventricle, and the whole heart's the size of your fist. So you're not moving blood very far. Atria have a very thin wall of muscle. I mean, not in comparison to most blood vessels, but it's thin. Now you get to the ventricles, and you're sending blood away from the heart. So they're going to be thicker, more muscle, because they have to squeeze and generate enough pressure to send the blood away from the heart. Now, of the two, you have a right ventricle and a left ventricle. The right ventricle is sending blood to the lungs. That's still not very far. So it's got pressure. It's got more muscle than the atria because it's sending blood further. It's sending it outside the body to the chest. But that's not really far. Think what the left ventricle is doing. The left ventricle sends blood up, out to your arm, out to the other arm, up to the top of your head, down to the bottom of your toes, and has at least some pressure helping to get it back up, back to the heart. That has to move blood a lot further. So the left ventricle has a lot more muscle, really thick wall. So you can look at the heart, you can look at the four chambers, and you can tell based on the thickness of the wall roughly how much work they're doing. Anyway, that will come up eventually. But the heart, it's mostly made of myocardium. We're talking cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle fibers are striated. That means they have stripes, kind of like skeletal muscle, but they're involuntary, like smooth muscle. We can't control it and say, oh, I would like to beat now. We don't have that ability. Also, where it says each muscle fiber, muscle cell, it has lots of branches coming off. They're hooked to other cells that are branching. So what you have is a network, and where they're connected, the end of this cell, the beginning of this cell, they join at what we call an intercalated disc. It's a thing made out of protein with little tubes through it so that ions, chemicals, can go from one cell to the other cell. And this is super important. This is the reason why if we contract one heart cell, we're going to contract them all. Because if this one contracts, the ions that are causing it to contract will go through one of those branches into the next heart cell and make the thing happen there. That's why the cells contract pretty much in unison. What's happening to one is happening to the other. All right. They're also connected by desmosomes. A lot of people say this is like you rivet the cells together. They're proteins that attach the two membranes of the adjacent cells, of cells that are close to each other. All right, so double pump. We have, where is my mouse? Here. We have the atria contracting, and they push blood into the ventricles. All right. Then the ventricles contract, and we push blood. Now, this, I don't know why they chose to show you the backside of a heart, but you're looking at the backside. So what's over here is the right side, and what is over here is the left side. So when you contract the atria, the blood just goes from right to right or from left to left. When you contract the ventricles, blood goes up and two along and up and two along. So blood from this right ventricle, it goes that way, and it goes that way. Blood from the left ventricle, it goes up to the head and down to the toes and all around the body before it comes back to the right atria. All right, let's move on. So the heart is surrounded in a serous membrane. That means it's a membrane that's full of fluid for lubrication. Now, I say full of, I don't mean it's filled up like a water balloon. I mean, it's like you have a very thin layer of pericardium here, very thin layer of pericardium there. Like all serous membranes, we've got two layers, and we have names for the layers. The one that is away from the organ, we say, is to the periphery. So say I've got a heart here and it's surrounded by a serous membrane. There's one layer that is very close. It's stuck to it. And we would call that sorry, I realize that you don't need to be looking at my hand simulating a heart here. The layer that is stuck to the outside of the heart we would call this the visceral pericardium. The visceral are very close to the important organs. The other layer that is away from the heart, that is to the periphery, we would call the peripheral pericardium. So visceral pericardium, peripheral pericardium. And there's fluid in that sac. And that fluid allows the heart to beat and move without rubbing on other organs. It works better. It doesn't hurt. This is good. We do the same thing in the lungs. We have lungs need to expand, contract, expand, contract. We have another serous membrane around each heart, and we call those the pleura. Why did I say heart? We have another serous membrane around each lung, and we call that the pleura. So the pericardia around the heart, easy to remember because cardia, the pleura around the lungs, but same thing. You got a visceral layer, parietal layer, and slippery fluid between them. All right, so human heart, other animals different, but human heart, 2 atria at the top, 2 ventricles at the bottom. Atria contract and push blood to the ventricles. Ventricles contract and send blood away from the heart. All right, there it is. Yay, we got parts. This flap that's on the outside, it's an extension of the atria. It goes to the outside and then it goes to the outside and then folds down. Think of it as the floppy ear on a dog. Oscar, get over here. Okay, the dog is ignoring me. I was going to give you a floppy ear to look at, but those are called auricles. These layers right here, auricles, they are like a floppy dog's ear, except it would be more like a floppy balloon because there's a space inside. That space is extra space that can fill with blood when the atria are filling with blood because it's just part of the atria. All right. This is your vena cava. You have blood coming into the atria from above. That's the superior vena cava. Here you have blood coming into the heart from below. That's the inferior vena cava. There is a third thing that delivers blood into the heart, and that's the cardiac sinus. And you can't see it here, and so far I haven't seen a drawing where you do, but since we're looking at the backside of the heart, I'll tell you, if you stripped this fat off here, all that white fat, there is a thick, large, flabby blood vessel that passes around the back of the heart, and that's called the cardiac sinus. And it also empties its blood into the atria. All right, so let's move on. This is the pulmonary trunk, and it's super confusing because you see it drawn correctly on the left side of the heart, but this continues inside the heart down to there. And about here is where you have the contraction of the left ventricle that sends the blood out, and it goes through a valve at the bottom of the trunk. The valve is called a pulmonary semilunar valve. Then the blood goes out the trunk, the pulmonary trunk. Give me back my mouse. Goes out the pulmonary trunk, and then it's dividing, and you have some going to the left lung and some going to the right lung. Anyway, moving on. So the heart has 2 different types of valves. We have the semilunar valves. Those are named because they're, if you use your imagination, you might think of them as a half circle. But those valves are at the bottom of the pulmonary trunk. I just told you where one was, right here. The other one is at the bottom of the aorta. Now, if you notice the orientation, this is incredibly weird because the left side is being fed by the right ventricle. And the thing that looks like it's more on the right, which is the aorta, it's being fed by blood coming from the left ventricle. So you got some crisscross going on here. But at the junction at the edge of the of the ventricle, where it joins up with the major vessel. We have these valves called semilunar valves. They keep blood in the heart until the ventricles are squeezing enough to build up pressure to open them, and then the blood escapes into either the pulmonary trunk if the blood's being drained from the right side of the heart, or into the aorta, which is the big giant mega blood vessel for the heart. Anyway, so they got those two AV valves, those two semilunar valves. Then we have valves. There's probably a better drawing. Yeah, I don't see it. So we'll just assume, oh yeah, there. Okay. So semilunar valve, give me my mouse right here, and blood from the right ventricle goes through it. You can't really see the left ventricle valve. The aortic semilunar valve would be at the bottom of the aorta here. This is the aorta, but that's because they cut it away. All right, this drawing shows it cut away, but you have the semilunar valve at the bottom of the pulmonary trunk, semilunar valve at the bottom of the aorta. The other valves are between the atria and the ventricle, between the atria and the ventricle. That is a AV valve, an atrioventricular valve, speaking generically, a valve between the atria and the ventricle. And each one of the two valves has two names. The one over here on the right, we could call a tricuspid, okay? And the one on the left, we could call a bicuspid or mitral. The bicuspid is named because it has two cusps. You probably guessed that. But if you think of a bishop's pointy hat in the Catholic Church, that's called a mitre. That's the reason why people called it a mitral valve. Anyway, you have AV valves, like here we have our bicuspid, over here we have our tricuspid. You have semilunar valves that control the flow of blood out of the heart. Let's move on. All right. If you look here, the muscle of the heart needs to have oxygen. So you might say, well, you got blood flowing through the heart. Just take some of the oxygen from it. But the wall's so thick that if you did that, the outer layers of muscle, they still get no oxygen. And since the muscle of the heart needs oxygen, the muscle of the heart has its own blood vessels. We call these the coronary arteries that deliver blood to the heart muscle, and the coronary veins that drain the blood away from the blood vessel after we've already given oxygen, given nutrients, and we've picked up waste. So how does this work? Remember I said that the aorta was an elastic artery and it could expand and then come back? Well, you have blood flowing out of the left ventricle into the aorta, and the aorta then, as the blood flows into the aorta, the pressure inside of the ventricle drops, and that semilunar valve shuts, keeping the blood in the aorta. And the aorta is stretched, but it wants to go back to normal. So it's squeezing, trying to come back to normal size. And as it does, it pushes the blood out. And most of that blood that's pushed out goes around the aortic arch and through the whole body. But some of it, before we get into the arch even, we have the coronary arteries. That's not a good drawing. That's a better drawing. All right. So we've got blood going into this aorta. And instead of just going up to the arch, we also have vessels coming off like this. Okay. This one right here would be the circumflex artery. But anyway, It's named because this goes kind of like in a circle around the heart, except that there's a branch. Give me my mouse back. There's a branch over here that goes down. Think of a flexed knee goes down. That combination is why we call it the circumflex artery. Now, arteries and veins, the arteries are better named than the veins. The artery, the name tells you what they do. So for instance, we've got an artery here on the front that they're probably going to call the anterior interventricular artery. Love that name. Anterior, it's on the front. Interventricular, it's between the ventricles. It runs down the septum, the wall that keeps the left from the right. Okay, great name. I know exactly where that is when I hear that. And so, we have things like the marginal artery over here. These names are good. The veins are horribly named. So here we have this great name, the anterior interventricular artery. And then we have the vein that runs in that same sulcus, the same groove. It's the great cardiac vein. In other words, it's a vein and it's big, and that's all the name tells you. It tells you nothing else useful. So that kind of annoys me, how the arteries have these nice specific names, and the veins, the names are not as informative. That's a polite way to put it. But there's an even bigger problem. These are names that you're probably not going to hear. Anatomists are the ones who call this the anterior interventricular artery. If you talk to a doctor, you go to a hospital and they're talking about something involving this vessel, they're going to call that vessel the LAD. It's short for left anterior descending. So coming off the aorta, you have a left coronary artery and a right one, and then they branch to do different things. This left one will then divide further, and one of the branches is going down. It's coming off the left artery, and it's going downward, and it's on the front. So left, that's which coronary artery it comes off of. Anterior, because it's on the front of the heart. Give me my mouse back. And descending, because it flows down. So anyway, coronary arteries supply blood to the muscle. Coronary veins drain it and have horrible names. Coronary artery disease is when you have a blockage, and that could increase the chance of having a MI, a myocardial infarction, a heart attack. Basically, if the heart is not getting enough oxygen, it can go into a heart attack. And so blockages in these coronary arteries are stopping the blood from going where it needs to and delivering the oxygen. All right. So let's do the blood flow through the heart. I already told you this means you're going to hear me sing. It'll be horrible. Let's just live with it. So you remember the song started with the right atria is where the process begins, where the CO2 blood enters the heart. That's perfect, but the book is starting a step before that. The superior vena cava. Do we have a nice picture again? No, we don't. Okay, we'll go back to this pretty picture. The superior vena cava is this blood vessel. It's blue because it's low in oxygen. It's high in CO2. It's not really blue. It's brick red, but those vessels look bluish to us. because of the low oxygen content. The hemoglobin takes a different shape. We'll talk about that later, I'm sure. Blood coming from the head and the neck and the upper arms, it drains into this superior vena cava and then down into the right atria. This one, blood from the rest of the body, the abdomen, the lower legs, your feet, all of that stuff, that blood is going to come back in the inferior vena cava, which literally means the cavernous vessel, the really big vessel. The blood's going to come up through there, and it's going to come out in they'll have a hole that goes into your right atria. So here we got our right atria. You see the auricles have been cut away in the strong, but we have blood coming from 3 different places. Blood coming from above, that's going to be superior vena cava. Blood coming from below, that's inferior vena cava. And then you have the sinus, the cardiac sinus, draining the blood away from the coronary arteries and delivering it back into the rest of the blood in the atria, in the right atria. Anyway, and I don't see the sinus here. It's probably about right there. What I do see right here is the foramen ovale, it literally, or fossa ovale. This is a normal patient, and so it's a fossa ovale. The name means the oval hole, or the oval spot. The name means the oval spot. That's something that closes after you're born. When you're a fetus, this space, there's no flap there. That oval is an oval-shaped hole to the other atria, from the right atria over, give me my mouse, right atria over here, into the left atria over here. So anyway, moving on. The superior and inferior vena cava, I got off on a sidetrack, but you saw where they are. Superior above, inferior below. They're both carrying low oxygen, high carbon dioxide blood. You know that because the song, the right atria is where the process begins, where the CO2 blood enters the heart. Superior vena cava coming into the heart from above, inferior vena cava coming from below. Both of those are carrying blood into the atria. There's a third vessel, it's not mentioned here, but on the back of the heart in this area, you have the coronary sinus. It's carrying blood from the coronary arteries back into the atria. All 3 of these are delivering low oxygen, high carbon dioxide blood. We're going to then go take all the flow on the right side of the heart is blood that we're about to send to the lungs to get rid of that carbon dioxide to pick up the oxygen. So here we have superior vena cava blood coming in, inferior vena cava blood coming in, and that blood's going to go through the tricuspid into the right ventricle, and then it will go through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk, which will go off to the left side. Here you have two arteries going to the left heart, 2 going to the right heart. 2 going to the left lung, 2 going to the right lung. Notice that the right one actually passes under the aortic arch and behind the superior vena cava. Anyway, moving on. Vena cava, we're delivering oxygen poor, carbon dioxide rich blood and to the right atria. So they're going to go through the tricuspid, the right AV valve. AV is short for atrioventricular, meaning it's the valve between the right atria and the right ventricle. But more people call it the tricuspid because it has 3 parts. If you imagine, it definitely has 3 clusters of chordae tendineae to stabilize it. Anyway, the right ventricle is going to pump blood through it says through the pulmonary valve. I would call that the pulmonary semilunar valve. which is at the bottom of the pulmonary trunk. Anyway, through that valve into the trunk, and that will branch into left and right pulmonary arteries. And we already said the right one goes under the aortic arch behind the superior vena cava. Those pulmonary arteries carry blood away. Remember, arteries always carry blood away from the heart. They're carrying blood away from the heart to the lungs. That's where the pulmonary part of the name comes in. All right, at the lungs, they're going to dump their carbon dioxide, pick up their oxygen, and then that blood will be delivered through veins back to the left atria. Okay, so blood will flow through the okay, why are we saying that? Okay, it's because we've already done what I was just describing. Okay, so the pulmonary veins coming back from the lungs bring this oxygen-rich blood back from the lungs and dump it in the left atria. Let's go back to our picture. Wow, I wish that was oriented slightly, because the way it's oriented, most of the atria is behind the pulmonary trunk and you can't see it very well. Let's see if we've got better. Yeah, they're not great drawings. Okay, they're very detailed drawings. They're not drawings that are that are good at making this clear. Anyway, so I'll stop whining about the drawings. Let's move on. So the oxygenated blood arrives at the oxygenated blood arrives at the left atria, goes to the bicuspid. Sorry, we were on the next slide. Goes to the bicuspid and into the left ventricle, and the left ventricle contracts. It will go through, they're calling it the aortic valve. I would call it the aortic semilunar valve, but it's the valve at the bottom of the aorta and into the aorta. The aorta is a huge blood vessel, but it's also a very elastic blood vessel. As the blood rushes out of the left ventricle, comes out, the aorta is going to swell and expand with all the blood coming into it. Then as it tries to contract and the heart relaxes, the semilunar valve will slap shut to keep the blood from going back into the heart. Anyway, the aorta is going to branch into smaller arteries, arterioles. This goes through the whole body. That's blood flow for the whole body. The ones that we're about to talk about, I think, are the coronary arteries, which are little tiny arteries coming off of the base of the aorta just above that valve, and they're the ones that carry oxygen to the heart itself. Anyway, I think we already mentioned this, but the left ventricle is thicker than the right ventricle because they're moving blood farther. They're having to pump harder. Okay, and both ventricles are thicker than the atria because the atria, you're just moving blood from the atria to the ventricle, not very far. So thin walls. Okay, very thin walls up here in the atria. Ventricle a little thicker because the right one, you're delivering blood to the lungs, has to move a little further. But the left one, when it has a huge thick wall, because when the left ventricle contracts, you're sending blood up and to the head and out to the arms, tip of the fingers, all the way back down to the toes. All that flow for the whole body is left atria. Okay, so the thicker the wall, the more work it does. And that means the atria, fairly thin, the ventricles a little thicker, but the left atria much thicker. All right. So let's talk about the cardiac cycle. The atria contract first, and then the ventricles, and then the heart relaxes. Now, when this happens, the atria contract. What happens is blood entering the atria passively flows through the AV valve down into the ventricle, but then you have the atria contract and they squeeze blood into the ventricle to fill it up all the way. Then when the ventricle starts to contract and the atria starts to relax, your AV valves, your tricuspid and your bicuspid, blow shut as the pressure builds. And I don't blow all the way through and let blood back into the atria. That doesn't happen because you have the chordae tendineae stabilizing the ends of valves. Anyway, the edges of the valves. So systole is when the heart's contracting. Diastole is when the heart is relaxing. Easy to remember the difference. S, think Superman, think flying up high. That's when the blood pressure is high. Diastole, think dirt. The D should remind you of the word dirt because the blood pressure is down low, like on the dirt. Okay. The heart on average beats 60 times a minute. There are two sounds, lub-dub, lub-dub. The first sound is the AV valves closing. Makes sense because we have 4 valves and the 2 AV valves close as we start to build up pressure in the ventricles and relax the atria. The second sound, the dub, the bigger, more prominent sound, is when the bigger semilunar valves slap shut. That is after blood has been shoved out of the heart. So the second part gives the second sound. Anyway, if you hear a murmur, your valves are leaky, and that probably means you've got stretched out valves, damaged chordae tendineae, something like that. All right, there we have it. Aortic semilunar valve, serious big valve there. But you can see the cycle. You can see that we fill. Where do they say dub? Where's lub? Okay. Yes, so we have filled with oxygen. Sorry, we have filled with blood, and we've filled with blood. We contract. We send the blood. Oh, that's why, because the arrows are going this way. That makes more sense. We fill with blood. We contract the atria. We squeeze into the ventricles. Then the ventricles start to contract. See the ventricles contracting here? Well, as the ventricles contract, they are pushing blood up against the valves, and the valves slap shut. So valves open, blood flows through, ventricle contracts, valves slam shut. That's the lub. Then as pressure increases, keeps going as the ventricle contracts, eventually it overcomes the pressure in the pulmonary trunk here and in the aorta there, and the semilunar valves are opened. So blood flows out, and then when this starts to relax, and the ventricles start to relax, and the vessels that stretched are trying to return to their normal size, then you're going to get the pressure higher here, and these open semilunar valves will slam shut. That's the dub sound, and you move on. You do it all again. Okay. So you have 2 nodes in the heart, the SA node and the AV node. These are your pacemakers. All right. What happens is you've got leaky ion channels, okay? And like a nerve rests at negative 70 millivolts. The cells in this spot have leaky channels, and so they go higher, 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 all by themselves as you have more positive ions leaking into the muscle cell. When they get to a certain level, that's called the threshold, then it's so positive that little trap doors on valves swing out of the way because they're positively charged. So if you have a lot of positive leaking into this heart cell, leaking in from other spots in the membrane, and it gets close, then these positive charges repel these positive charges. The trap door swings open, and now lots of positive sodiums from the outside come rushing in, and you get a big that's when they come in, you've reached the threshold, and now you have a big contraction. But because of the intercalated discs, what happens in this one goes and affects that one, and affects that one, affects that one. Anyway, we'll get back on track. The SA node, that's the first one in the right atria. And there's probably a pretty picture of where it is. Yeah, there is. Okay, so the SA node is way up high in the heart. It's near the superior vena cava. The AV node is down closer to the line, the division between the atria and the ventricles. Okay. I actually would have thought that this would be a little closer to there, and this would be a little closer to there. But okay, whatever. The idea, the SA node is higher, it's further away, it's fast. What you need to understand is that let's leave nerves out of it, leave heart cells out of it for a second. Let's talk electricity. When you send electricity through a wire, you can have high resistance wires and low resistance wires. A low resistance wire would be big diameter, okay? And if something is lower resistance, you would think you might be able to move faster. Well, that's what happens in the heart. So we have tracks between the SA node and the AV node. More importantly, we have these tracks that go all the way down here to the apex of the heart, and they go up here to the papillary muscles, which I hadn't really talked about before. Say this is the wall of the heart, then you have little papilla. Remember, papilla means a finger-like extension. They are little muscles that stick up like a papilla. Those are the spots that your chordae tendineae, give me my mouse, that your chordae tendineae are attached to. We'll get to that in a second. But what I want to make clear is that, yes, if one heart muscle cell contracts, all the others will try to contract, but they don't all contract at the same rate. And that's what we're about to talk about, how we coordinate the contraction of the heart. So the SA node, that's the upper one. It sends out a signal, electrical signal. It'll cause the atria to contract. The reason why it doesn't cause the whole heart to contract is that those intercalated discs, those connections that are going on, that's pretty much above the atria, so above the AV valve, the atria, why do I say valve? It's above the atrioventricular septa or below the atrioventricular septa. And then we have these Purkinje fibers that are mentioned. Those are those tracks I was showing you a picture of. They cross the septa. They cross the atrioventricular septa. So what that means, because this is pretty much isolated from this will contract, and then the signal goes through down. Well, sorry, this will contract, and then this will contract. You know, we do that. We just talked about the lub dub. Okay, well, those are the valves. So we talked about how we double pump here, there, here, there, here, there. How do you make that happen? Well, you start the contraction in the atria. You start the electrical signal in the atria. And that electrical signal is going to spread all over in the atria. The atria are going to contract. But then we need the ventricle to contract. So we have to have a connection. But what's really interesting is how we do it. The connection between the atria and the ventricle would be right here. Okay. And it's hard to tell when you're looking right here, but this yellow, these Purkinje fibers, are actually traveling down the atrioventricular septa. So what you do is you cross a little bit, you go around the wall of the ventricle, but mostly you're traveling down to the apex of the heart through the through the interventricular septa. Now, these Purkinje fibers are big, low resistance, and the signal travels fast. And that's super important because say we've contracted our atria, that forces the blood down into the ventricle. We don't want to then start the contraction right here. We don't want the ventricle to contract at the middle of the heart, just below the AV septa. We want the contraction to start down here at the tip. You understand why. If you've ever grabbed a tube of toothpaste in the middle, that would be about the middle of the heart. you've got all this toothpaste down here at the end that's not coming out. If you grab it down at the tip of the tube of toothpaste, it squeezes all the toothpaste out. Okay. Same thing. If we can start the contraction at the apex, we can get more blood to go out of the heart. So we know we want to start near the tip. These Purkinje fibers are really fast because they're really big diameter. So the electrical signal goes down the Purkinje fibers, hits the apex. Before any of these cells are getting their signal to contract, we've already started the contraction at the tip. And that lets us do it like we would want to, squeezing from the apex upward to deliver a stronger flow, get more of the blood out. Great. But these Purkinje fibers are even cooler. Look at how they wrap up on the side. We continue at high speed all the way up there to these papillary muscles with the chordae tendineae coming off of them. What that means is that as we start our contraction here, we're going to contract at the papillary muscles. So before the bulk of the heart muscles in the ventricle are contracting, we're contracting the papillary muscles. Basically, what the papillary muscles are doing is, oh, there's a contraction coming. Pull on the chordae tendineae, pull on the chordae tendineae, pull those cords, and it will hold the valve down like this. So it doesn't blow up like that. It doesn't backwash blood in the atria. Instead, we pull them down, and then as the ventricle pressure is building, it does this, but it can't go any further because the papillary muscles are keeping the valve shut. It's a really good system. Anyway, so the impulse travels. Okay, the AV node sends a signal down the AV bundle and the Purkinje fibers that causes ventricular contraction. Totally true. Impulses travel through gap junctions in the intercalated discs. We already talked about that. If you contract one heart cell, you contract them all because you're sending the electrochemical signals from one cell to the next one through the intercalated disc. The gap junctions are the little tubes that go through that intercalated disc. All right, now that's internal control of the heart. What I'm saying is you could have a heart removed from the body, and as long as it's been given oxygen and nutrients and has the ability, it's going to keep beating. It doesn't need a signal from the outside to beat. Now we do have outside control, and that's what makes our heart rate go up or heart rate go down. Any control from the outside is what we call extrinsic control. And this could be done with hormones. This could be done electrically. The vagus nerve will stimulate the heart, and the vagus actually will slow it down. Let's move on. Well, they're not going to talk about that, so I'll just throw it in here. If you're ever working in a nursing home, you have a problem sometimes. You have somebody sitting on a toilet and they squeeze too hard, and they're so that they'll black out and fall. Why? Why would going to the bathroom, why would pooping make someone black out and fall? Because the vagus nerve also is down there at the rectum. And if you're having to work too hard to push a stool out, a bowel movement out, you're squeezing as the muscle squeeze, you're squeezing on that vagus nerve. And it's telling the heart, slow down, slow down, slow down. And in an older person, it might slow down enough you're not delivering good blood flow to the brain, and then the person blacks out and they fall. So, yeah, like in a nursing home, one of the things they have to check on is the old man so-and-so, we sent him to the bathroom. Have you checked to make sure he got out of the bathroom okay, or did he black out? Anyway, let's move on. Electrocardiogram. They used to write EKG. That's just because Germans did it first, and they spell cardio with a K. But EKG, ECG is the same thing. It's a recording of the electrical changes in the heart during a contraction. Now, let's make this very clear. That's electrical changes. It is not the contraction. It is the signal to contract. That's important because the signal has to come before the response. And heartbeats are dealing with short periods of time. But understand that before we have this happen and we push blood into the ventricle, or before we have this happen and we push blood into the pulmonary trunk and the aorta, before that happens. So before the atrial contraction, there's a signal for the atria to contract. And that's the P wave. Okay. That's the P wave. Let's look right here. Here we have a P wave. That's the electrical signal telling the atria to contract. Then we have a QRS, and that's two things on top of each other. It is the atria relaxing and the ventricle contracting. Then we have the T wave, that is the ventricle relaxing. Then we're set up, we're back to normal. You might say, why don't we see the, why isn't there a atria relaxing? Well, there is. It's happening at the same time as this, and you can't make it out clearly because there's so much ventricle contraction signal happening at the same time. So signal to contract, signal to contract, signal to contract atria, electrical signal as atria relaxes, but at the same time, signal for ventricle to contract, and then signal for ventricle to relax. So what I'm getting at is we have our P wave, signal for atria to contract. Then we actually have, give me my mouse, then we actually have the contraction happening after that. Then we have signal for ventricle to contract. We have ventricle contracting, and then we have signal for ventricle to relax. And somewhere in here under the T, the ventricle is going to actually start the relaxing. Anyway, so the P wave is signal to the atria. The QRS is ventricles and also atria relaxing. And recovery of the ventricles is the T. There it is. You can see abnormalities right here. This is a heart attack. This is a bad heart attack. You can see that the ventricle is just quivering. Okay, it's just constantly getting signal to contract. It's never getting filled by the atria. It won't pause and let it fill up. So too much it. The ventricle will not pause to let the atria fill it with blood that could then be sent out through one strong contraction instead of having little quivers. All right. An EKG could detect things like ventricular fibrillation, uncoordinated, irregular signals in the ventricles. The heart can't pump blood. The tissues get starved for oxygen. Heart can't pump, like I said, because during ventricular fibrillation, this is what we need to do, is have the atria fill, but the ventricle won't pause to let that happen. You've probably heard of or seen on TV where a bunch of nurses and doctors gather around someone having a heart attack and they yell, "Clear!" and they put electrical signal out. A lot of people think, oh, they're trying to restart the heart. No, they are actually trying to reset it or reboot it. What they're doing is trying to get everything to contract at once, like major electrical signal. And then hopefully when things restart, it'll be listening to, okay, SA node, AV, your turn. Or so SA node says contract. Atria contracts, fills the ventricle with blood, and then the ventricle contracts and sends the blood out. They're trying to get that to happen again. All right, here's to check your progress. I'm going to pause for a minute and then you can continue. Okay, so features of the cardiovascular system. We're going to talk about pulse and heart rate and pulse pressure. We'll talk about how blood flow in the veins and arteries is different from capillaries. Veins are going to be lower pressure, they're bigger diameter. Um, and we'll talk about systolic and diastolic pressure. Remember, the S in systolic reminds you of Superman because that's the high pressure, like Superman flying. And the D in diastolic reminds you that's the down low pressure because D like dirt. All right, moving on. So blood pressure is the pressure of the blood against a blood vessel. And it's highest in the aorta because you're closest to the heart. And it decreases as you move through the body. Pulse pressure is a surge of blood, okay? And the walls will stretch and then recoil. Obviously, we have some arteries that are super elastic and they stretch really well. We tend to measure pulse at the radial artery in the wrist or carotid artery in the neck. And what we're doing is measuring the heart rate, which is probably around 70 beats per minute in a healthy individual. 60 to 80 would be acceptable. The ventricles contracting create the pulse pressure because those are what are sending the blood out of the heart. The atria, when they contract, you're just sending blood from the atria to the ventricles, so not much is happening. It's not affecting the arteries; they're further away. That you're not going to measure that. We measure blood pressure with a blood pressure cuff, but of course, this is an anatomy type class, so you have to learn the fancy name. The real name of a blood pressure cuff is a sphygmomanometer. Sphygmomanometer. All right. And you're measuring that at the brachial artery of the arm. Remember, this arm, this is the brachial region. All right. The artery that when it was in the armpit was called axillary. You move further down. It's like a road. You know how you're driving down a road and like, oh, you're on this road, and you don't change roads, but they give it a different name on a different block. It's that thing. Okay. So it's called an axillary artery, then it's called a brachial artery. All right. So brachial artery, and actually, when it's underneath the collarbone, it's the subclavian. Then it's the axillary as it comes through the armpit. Then it's the brachial. All right. So moving on, here it is. If you squeeze with enough pressure that the artery is closed, no sound, no blood is flowing through. If you open it all the way, no sound. If you have pressure in between, it's close to being closed, but it's light enough that the blood can go squirting through. It'll make the walls vibrate, and that'll make it sound. We call it the sounds of Korotkov. It's a little like if you have a balloon, and if you pull super tight, like a balloon full of air, and you know that thing where people let air out, but they're pulling a little bit and it squeaks, makes that horrible. Okay. That's like the sound of Korotkov. That's when you have a little bit of pressure. When you have full on pressure, air's not coming out of that balloon. When you let go, air's coming out of the balloon. But if you're in between with a little bit of pressure, the walls are vibrating as air zips by and it makes noise. And that noise is what we hear with the where you can hear the blood pressure through the stethoscope. Sorry, where you can hear the heart beating through the stethoscope. What you're hearing is the blood squirting by with each beat, with each ventricular contraction. And we call the sound that's being made the sounds of Korotkov. Anyway, so systolic pressure, the high pressure, remember Superman. That's when blood is leaving the heart. Diastolic, the low, remember down low like dirt. The low pressure is when the ventricles are relaxing. If someone has too high of blood pressure, we say they have hypertension. If they have too low of blood pressure, we say they have hypotension. Hypo means below, just like if someone gives you a shot, they're using a hypodermic needle. It's a needle that goes below your dermis, below the inner layer of the skin. All right, so here we have a table. I recommending knowing the numbers. What's hypotension? What's hypertension? Um, so, and they're actually stages of hypertension. Having too high of a blood pressure is really bad. Um, it can lead to COPD, congestive obstructive pulmonary disorder. Then you'd end up being like unable to walk across the room without being winded because you're having trouble moving blood. Basically, what happens is blood only leaves the ventricles if if the pressure the heart generates is higher than the pressure that's already in the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. If their pressure is already super high, it takes more force to overcome the pressure and open the semilunar valves and let the blood out. So where we say that you have COPD, that'd be when the pressure is so high that the heart's really having to work hard to overcome the pressure. You're making the heart work harder. You're increasing the risk of a heart attack. So blood flow will decrease as you move away from the heart. Not surprising. Pressure's highest close to the pump. All right. It's slowest in the capillaries. That makes sense. This is the place that we are trying to exchange oxygen, pick up carbon dioxide, send out nutrients. We move the blood as slowly as possible so we can do that easily. All right. And the pressure is adjusted by those precapillary sphincters. They control whether the blood flows through a capillary bed or not. All right. So here we look at velocity and pressure. All right. So blood flow, we start close to the heart, we end far away from the heart. So we start by moving through arteries, we go to arterioles, to capillaries, to venules, to veins. You can see that it says relative magnitude, talking about the pressure. Okay. The heartbeat is only being shown in the arteries arterial side. When we get to the capillaries, we've got so many capillaries spread out so much the pressure has dropped down, way down. Everything from there on, you're not seeing the pressure because you are not seeing huge spikes in pressure. Okay. You are just trying to collect it. Blood goes uphill and captured. Goes uphill, and when it tries to come down, the endothelium comes and captures it. Little venous flaps. All right, so blood pressure is really low in the veins. It doesn't contribute much to movement of blood. We move blood through the venous system and the lymphatic system. Everything you're hearing about the venous system, it's even more that way in the lymphatic system. So we have the valves I just talked about that stop blood from going back down, but we also have the respiratory pump. As you inhale, you're pushing, the muscles are pushing on the veins. They're pushing, and the veins are like, say, here's the rib and here's a muscle. The muscle contracts, and that means it gets shorter and thicker. As it gets thicker, the vein that's trapped there gets squeezed between a rib and an expanding muscle, so it gets squashed. When it gets squashed, you go up. Can't go down because valves. All right, so the skeletal muscle pump, same idea. If we have two muscles right here and we have a vein between them, the blood is sitting there. Now, say we contract those muscles, say we're walking, okay? We contract those muscles. Both muscles get a little shorter, a little wider, and when they do, they should do it like that. When we do, it squeezes the vein. And that means the blood, just like if you squeeze a balloon, the air wants to go that way and that way, except in this case, we got valves to stop it from going that way. It can only go uphill. All right. Oh, here's a check your progress. I'm going to pause and let you continue. Hey, let's do the thing. So, cardiovascular pathways. We're going to talk about the flow of blood in the pulmonary and the systemic circuits. I'll tell you right now, the pulmonary system, most of the body, arteries are delivering highly oxygenated blood, and veins are carrying deoxygenated blood. The stuff that in models will look blue. The pulmonary system is backwards because arteries are carrying blood to the lungs, where we get rid of carbon dioxide, pick up oxygen, and the veins bring the oxygenated blood back to the heart. How do you keep this straight? What you're saying is what's an artery and what's a vein? It's not based on the red or the blue on the chart. Exactly. That's exactly what I'm saying. This is how you keep it straight. Arteries always go away from the heart. Arteries away. So the A should remind you. Veins bring blood very close to the heart. Veins are bringing blood back to the heart. Okay. So we're going to talk about some of the arteries and veins, at least the major ones that you need to know. We'll talk about oxygen content. In the systemic circuit, the normal thing that you see, arteries, arterioles have more oxygen than veins and venules. And the hepatic portal system. Oh, that's easy peasy. Anyway, moving on. So, pulmonary system sends blood through the lungs. Systemic system sends it through everywhere else after you've done the pulmonary and picked up oxygen from the lungs. All right, there we go. You can see it. This is a lovely drawing. I really like it. So you can see that, give me my mouse, thank you. You can see that we have, I'm just going to do the song again. The right atria is where the process begins, where the CO2 blood enters the heart, through the tricuspid valve to the right ventricle, the pulmonary arteries and lungs. It should say the pulmonary semilunar valve, the pulmonary trunk, the pulmonary arteries and lungs. Once inside the lungs, it dumps its carbon dioxide, picks up its oxygen supply, then it's back to the heart, through the pulmonary veins, to the atria. The song doesn't say it, but it should say bicuspid. Bicuspid, the atria and left ventricle. All right, moving on. But understand that everything happening on the right side is to send blood to the lungs to get oxygen. Everything happening on the left side is to send that blood through the whole body and give all the tissues oxygen. So the pulmonary circuit, the right atria pumps deoxygenated blood into the right ventricle, which pumps it into the pulmonary trunk, through the pulmonary semilunar valve and into the trunk. The pulmonary trunk splits into left and right pulmonary arteries, which go to the lungs. They branch into arterioles, still low oxygen, which lead to capillaries. That's where we do our gas exchange. We pick up our oxygen, we dump our carbon dioxide. Then we have to come back. The pulmonary capillaries go to venules, which merge into veins. These are high oxygen veins. They're the only place in the body we have high oxygen veins. It's in the pulmonary system. And these pulmonary arteries are low oxygen. These pulmonary veins are high oxygen. These pulmonary veins deliver the blood back to the right atria, high oxygen blood to the right atria. Now we're about to talk about the systemic circuit. The left ventricle pumps high oxygen blood into the aorta. Oh, sorry. Yeah, what I said is true. But the left ventricle pumps high oxygen blood into the aorta, and that branches off to all the tissues. The arteries branch into arterioles, which go to capillaries. The capillaries are where we do the gas exchange, where we dump our oxygen, pick up our carbon dioxide, dump our nutrients, pick up our waste. The capillaries will lead to venules, which drain into veins, which drain into the vena cava, which literally means the cavernous, the really big veins. The vena cava superior and inferior, empty into the right atria. All right. Major arteries. The stuff on 512, yeah, image 512, all of that's fair game. I'm expecting that they probably will emphasize big things. So that's like aorta and aorta, aortic arch, ascending aorta, aortic arch, descending aorta. Branches off as we're talking subclavian, carotid, things like that. They'll probably emphasize things based on name, like when the subclavian turns into the axillary, which turns into the brachial. All those names say where they are. They might just go for some things based on size, like the femoral artery over the femur or the great saphenous vein. Those are big things for the leg, obviously. Yeah. Anyway, anything on this chart, fair game. So the systemic circuit continues. What are we going to say? All right. Usually blood flows from the aorta into an artery for an organ and then through veins back to the vena cava. Oh, yeah. So now here's our exception. We're going to the liver. All right. A hepatic means liver. And if you think about it, we absorb nutrients from our digestive system, and then we got to send stuff to the liver to filter it. All right. So the hepatic portal vein is going to take nutrient-rich blood from the digestive system to the liver. The liver is going to take those amino acids and from the digestive system and make proteins. And it's going to take glucoses that are floating around in the blood and turn them into glycogens. It will remove toxins, including alcohol, things that could make you sick. The liver is a big filter. It makes things, but a lot of filtering. The blood will drain from the liver into the hepatic veins, which go into the inferior vena cava. So basically, we're going to pass all of the things we absorb with the digestive system through a filter, the liver, before we go back into the venous system and go to the heart and get oxygen. All right, so that's 5.5. You can pause this if you can answer the questions. If you can't, rewind it, watch this section again, and I'm going to pause for a moment, and then I'll continue. All right. So we're going to talk about exchange of the capillaries. This is pretty easy to understand. I have two types of pressure: hydrostatic pressure, osmotic pressure. Hydrostatic pressure is the pressure generated by the heart. It's highest closest to the heart. So it's highest at the heart end of the capillary. It's lowest at the vein end of the capillary. What that means is that at the heart end of the capillary, pressure is pushing fluid out of the capillary. Great. At the vein end of the capillary, that pressure is almost gone. There's not pressure to push fluid out. But because that fluid, when it's pushed out, is fluid, it's not the big cells that won't fit out of the capillary. It's not the big proteins that won't fit out the wall of the capillary. Those things stay. And water wants to dilute stuff. So when the fluid, which is mostly water, leaves at the heart end of the capillary, that's pushed out by the hydrostatic pressure, as we move through the capillary, down the capillary, I should have done that. We move through the capillary, down the capillary. At the other end, you have much more concentrated blood because you've lost all the fluid. Water wants to dilute things, so it's going to flow back into the concentrated blood at the capillary to dilute it. And when it flows back in, it's going to pick up it's going to bring back the waste, bring back the carbon dioxide. And the water wanting to come back in, we call that osmotic pressure. If something is very concentrated, there's osmotic pressure to bring water to it. All right, so two forces driving driving fluid in and out of capillaries. Blood pressure, which they call hydrostatic pressure, pushes the fluid out of the capillary, mainly at the artery end, the heart end of the capillary bed. And the cells and the plasma proteins can't go out, so fluid goes out. At the other end, osmotic pressure brings it back. It makes sense if your hydrostatic pressure, if your pressure from the heart is dissipated, that's not pushing fluid out anymore. But because you pushed fluid out and made it more concentrated as you went down, water wants to come in and dilute. All right, so osmotic pressure, water wanting to come and dilute stuff, it brings the water back into the capillary through osmosis. Remember osmosis, the O reminds you this is the movement of H2O. This is the water coming back in. Some of the fluid that we push out, though, we're never going to get back. That's why we have a lymphatic system. If it won't come back into the capillary, we can put it into the lymphatic system and then deliver it back into the cardiovascular system. All right, so movement of solutes. You can see that at the artery end, there's huge amounts of hydrostatic pressure pushing the fluids out. And as we move on, down, we get to very little pressure to push things out. Now, as we go down this capillary, you can see that the blood's a little concentrated, but down here it's super duper concentrated, and the fluid that was pushed out is now wanting to be pulled in. You might have a little bit of that here, but not much because the blood's not that concentrated. As we get more and more concentrated, we have more and more cells, more and more proteins, higher concentration, the osmotic pressure pulls the water back in. That's a fancy way of saying the water wants to go in to dilute things. All right. So there you have lymphatic vessels around the capillaries. If we push fluid out, we always have hydrostatic push out a little more than osmotic can bring back in. We bring the extra stuff back through the lymphatic system. And those green vessels they're showing are the lymphatic system. Those are lymph capillaries. All right. Here's to check your progress. I'm going to pause. You see if you can answer it. If not, rewind and watch this section again. So, cardiovascular disease, it kills lots of people in Western nations. Disorders, we have anything that's a disorder of the blood vessel is a cardiovascular disease. Vascular because it affects vessels. Hypertension is high blood pressure. Atherosclerosis is scarring of the blood vessels. Usually we're talking about building up a plaque made out of bad cholesterol. If the plaque narrows the blood vessel diameter, it makes it hard to get blood to the tissues, but also those plaques can be a site where clots form. If clots form, then they might float around. They might break off and float around. That's an embolus. If they lodge, it's a thromboembolus. At that point, they have cut off the blood flow to all the tissues that vessel is supposed to be feeding. They've cut off all the oxygen to them. So here we have an example of a nasty plaque, and you can see that it's made out of fat and cholesterol, and the blood vessel is greatly narrowed. A stroke happens when you block one of these cranial arteries to the brain, or it breaks. Part of the brain dies because you don't have oxygen. It could cause your hands or your face to get numb. You have difficulty speaking. You have difficulty seeing in one eye. Very bad. An MI is a heart attack, and part of the heart dies because it's not getting oxygen. This happens because your coronary artery is blocked. Angina, pectoris. Angina means pain. Pectoris means where your pectoral muscles are, your chest. Okay. So you start getting chest pain from a partially blocked coronary artery. They could give you drugs that help make those vessels dilate so you can get more blood through. Now, if they've started doing this, it's not like it solves the problem entirely, but the problem is when you have an MI and part of the heart dies, the tissue that it's replaced by is scar tissue. It's not functional heart muscle tissue, and that's bad. So, because it makes your heart get weaker. So what they've started experimenting with now is putting stem cells in that, instead of growing scar tissue and making the heart weaker, they could replace it with functional heart tissue, functional muscle tissue. An aneurysm is when the vessel stretches out, gets really weak. If it ruptures, you're not delivering blood to the brain like you should be. Not delivering blood to anywhere that's supposed to be. You're spilling the blood out into the body. That could kill you. Obviously, if you have pre-existing condition like hypertension, like atherosclerosis, you've weakened the wall, made it more likely that an aneurysm will form. I mean, that just makes sense. Hypertension, you're pushing on the wall, pushing on the wall, pushing on the wall, pushing way more than normal. That wall will eventually give. So how do you treat clogged arteries? They could do a coronary bypass. It says a vein from the leg is taken, and that's probably going to be your great saphenous vein. Anyway, but yeah, they'll take a vessel, usually a vein from the leg. They'll remove it. It's not as bad as it sounds, because the veins have a lot of what we call anastomoses, places where the vessels grow together. And so if you can't drain through the normal vein, you probably have some other smaller vein nearby that you could drain through. So if they take out a vein and use it for a graft for a coronary artery replacement, it's possible. And it's your own tissue. You could try to grow new blood vessels with gene therapy. Then you wouldn't need to bypass the ones that have clogged. They could do angioplasty, where they stick a stent in a wire mesh and then inflate it to push the vessel open more. And that will dilate the vessel. Unfortunately, also make a place where clogs and clots can form. And so now they're trying to cover the stent with drugs that will stop the clots from forming. Anyway, there's a picture of them putting in a stent. All right. Heart failure. If the heart doesn't pump properly, you're in a world of hurt. You're probably going to die if they can't fix it. So one of the things that hypertension causes, because the heart's working, where you get an enlarged heart, and that's all kinds of problems. So they can wrap it to stop that from happening. They could put a miniature defibrillator inside the heart. They could do a heart transplant. Injection of stem cells, that's the one I already talked about. Left ventricular assist device, adding a pump, adding a mechanical pump to help the physical pump, the biological pump of the heart, so you can move more blood. Or like the Jarvik artificial heart, you could, it's not usually a solution. It's going to leave someone healthy. They're not going to go out and play football, but you could replace the heart with a mechanical heart. And there is a picture of said mechanical heart. So anyway, this is a check your progress, and I think, yeah, that is the very last one. So go ahead and see if you can answer stuff. If you can't, rewind to watch this last section. I will see you guys on our next video.